All right, so welcome to the 14th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. This is about the Mongol invasions of the Middle East. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the series, these are the rules. The first one is that this is not an academic presentation. I'm not certified in history, religion, culture, politics, any of the fields that we're going to be discussing tonight. And I'm not a military veteran or historian either. So I'm just presenting this from a layperson's perspective, but it will be a secular presentation, right? This presentation is not going to be from a Islamic perspective. I mean, it would be less of a case in this presentation, but it wouldn't be from a Tengris perspective either. It's trying to analyze the historical facts, not play into any divine or supernatural explanations. This is a difficult topic and a sensitive topic, so please let's be respectful. And while we're being respectful, though, we should be interactive. We should be asking questions, making comments, clarifications. This is supposed to be an interactive relationship between all of us. The next thing is that this will be a 101 and a 201, by which I mean, if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you know something, I'll probably tell you more than what you already knew. And of course, like all 13 of the previous lectures, this will be recorded. So you can see it on Omnicarta, which is Zach's website, or you can go directly to the YouTube page and watch it from there. I hope that you're excited to see this and perhaps even more presentations. So the quiz, see what you remember from last time. So question number 1, which of the following is incorrect about the Great Seljuk Empire? And reading over this, I realized that there were two answers.
C. I think it's C, right?
B is wrong. B was the one that I intended for people to notice. D was also wrong. I meant to put a not in there. But basically, one of the things that we took away from our lesson last time was that the Great Seljuk Empire was divided into these iqta, or fiefs that were run by particular Turkic groups. And these Turkic groups began to amass more and more power relative to the Great Seljuk, and therefore demand more and more autonomy, right? So it led to a great deal of infighting, which is why A is a true statement. Then B is also B is a false statement, right? Ahmad Sanjar was the last effective Great Seljuk. After him, the Khwarezm Shah, who came from the east, and the Eldeguzids, which came from the west, right? Modern day Afghanistan and northwestern Iran, respectively. They really wielded the power of the empire. So that's why B is false. C is true. We talked about the Nizari Ismaili uprising and how the Nizari Ismailis managed to convert a lot of peasants to their way of thinking because of the way that the aristocracy, the Persian aristocracy, and the Turkic military completely disregarded them and made them feel lesser than. And D is actually true. It's false. Sorry, D is false because Berke-Hülegü and Muhammad I Tafar were so involved in their civil war that they completely ignored the First Crusade. The fact that the Atabeg of Mosul or the leaders of Syria and Aleppo actually fought against the Crusaders, they did so without direct sanctioning from Berke-Hülegü, who was the Great Seljuk at that time. All right, question number 2. Which of the following were the 2 major battles that Ahmad Sanjar lost? Now choose 2 of the following. So those are your choices.
So you said the B and an E? No, well, I'm sorry. B, yeah, got it. Sorry, not a E. B and an F. Sorry.
It's E and F.
E and F, I'm
So,
sorry.
right, those were the two that we actually talked about, right? The Battle of Katwan against the Karachitai, also known as the Western Liao, which was a massive battle that Sanjar should not have lost, but because he lost it, really sealed the end of the Great Seljuk's ability to impose power eastwards, right into Central Asia. And after the battle with the Wild Oghuz Turks, this was a case where a number of Turkic groups just revolted, and they should have been easily put down, but they defeated Ahmad Sanjar and imprisoned him for 3 years and ran roughshod over many of the areas of the empire, which destroyed them from the heightened intellectual level that they had been before. All those other battles were battles that Ahmad Sanjar won against various rivals to the Great Seljuk. And in each one, he won quite handily and quite decisively. And so that was why in 1118 he was made the Great Seljuk. But unfortunately, he lost the two battles that he really needed to win, which is why the Seljuk Empire was so severely weakened. All right, question 3. Which of the following were groups that broke away from the Great Seljuk Empire and attempted to seek autonomy or independence? Choose all that apply.
A lot of them are hilarious, though.
I mean, they're all real states.
I know. So I mean, one we just spoke about, right?
Yeah, we talked about the Aldeguzids and the Khwarezm Shah. So obviously those are correct answers.
Yeah.
We talked about the Abbasid caliphs in our previous discussions, right? The Abbasid caliphs fought for independence against the Great Seljuk Empire and got terrestrial power for the first time in nearly 200 years. The Emirate of Tbilisi did not fight for independence. It was conquered by George the Builder after the Battle of Tigori. And the Nizari Ismailis did fight against the Great Seljuk, right? They took that residence in the Elburz Mountains in the northwestern part of Iran. And the Ghurids never fought for independence from the Great Seljuk Empire. They were never under Seljuk power. All right. Question number 4. Queen Tamar of Georgia was famous for which of the following? Choose all that apply.
So definitely F and C, and not sure about A. F, C, and A.
Yeah, those are the right answers, right? The conquest of Ardabil that David Soslan, her second husband, performed at her orders. She also helped create the Empire of Trebizond, and she was responsible for a golden age in Georgia that resulted in many artistic, literary, and cultural works. E is false. That was the area of the Khwarezm Shah in the Karakum Desert. D is false because that was the work of David the Builder. He built the Academy of Ikalto and the Galati Monastery. And B is false because even though she did outbid the Byzantines, she was unable to recover the True Cross from Saladin. She was able, though, to secure that Georgian monks would continue in Jerusalem after Saladin had recovered Jerusalem from the Crusaders.
Was there an investigation done when where was the True Cross, or it was lost for posterity? We don't know anything.
We don't actually know. The last time it really appears in the historical record is the Battle of Hattin in 1187, when the True Cross was rendered to Saladin as one of the items that he confiscated from the Crusaders who fought him that day, right?
Yeah.
We know that Al-Kamil promised the return of the True Cross to Frederick II Hohenstaufen during the Sixth Crusade, but he never actually gave it over. So it's unclear whether or not he even had it, and most historians believe he didn't.
No, there was if I could interject, there was a joke from around the period of the Crusades in the Middle East, which was, why does Lebanon have no more cedars? And the answer is because the Franks, that is the Europeans, all the Franks have a piece of the true cross.
Yeah. No, when it comes to holy relics, especially like the true cross, the amount of pieces of the true cross far supersede the actual size of a physical cross. So some of them must be forgeries, if not all of them.
There was an interesting fact. I mean, when about Hitler, right? I mean, there was so many artifacts. I mean, there was you know, the this artifact that was in Austria. It's the guy that, you know, pierced the Jesus Christ. What are they called?
Or the centurion's lens.
Centurion's lens, yeah. Then there was obviously the clock that's in Vatican. That they did the DNA on, right? That was from like 15th century, but they claimed it was from when Jesus Christ put the his face on it and stuff like that. So
the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, correct. So there's a lot of artifacts that you know, the interesting fact about it, which we'll do archaeology on and Old Testament. So
all right, question number 5 and the final question. Which of the following accurately describes the general public reaction in Persia when Khwarezm Shah Tekish conquered all of its territory?
between C and D, you know.
Anybody else want to take a guess?
Yeah, I'll yeah. D makes more sense. I don't know. The other ones are all concrete. Maybe I'm wrong. If you guys wanted to participate, we just take a guess. I mean, it's not a big deal. And then Richard will go about the explanation of why it's wrong or right. If anybody wants to take a guess. You can put it in the chat if you're not comfortable talking to.
All right, so the answer actually in this case is A. The Khwarezm Shah was really seen as a brute, an uncultured person, and that he maintained power through these nomadic soldiers that he employed, not because he had legitimate right. We also talked about how Tekish fought with the caliph, and they had a spat. The caliph sent him a vizier, he killed the vizier, and the two of them had this sort of tete-a-tete against each other, but it meant that he wouldn't be recognized as a legitimate Islamic ruler. And because of that, the peasantry by and large opposed him, right? Which is why C is also false. The peasants were against Tekish. The nobility was less negatively inclined. But because of that, as soon as Tekish died in the year 1200, there were revolts all across the Khwarezmian Empire, which now controlled most of Iran, because people were extremely angry with the governance style of Tekish and of the Khwarezm Shahs in general. And so obviously B is false, that he could end the rebellions and infighting, because he was causing so much dissent and anger that he was going to cause massive amounts of infighting. So also there's no clear point of purpose that that he would side with the Nizari Ismailis. In fact, he was generally opposed to them. Okay. So now we're going to move to what we actually are here today for. So, right, this is a map from the 1290s in terms of the actual borders. But what I want to focus on a little bit are the arrows. So we see on this map, when we look at the Ilkhanate, right, the Middle Eastern area, that there's sort of two arrow thrusts that we have. We have that orange thrust and we have the blue one, right? The orange one is during the life of Genghis Khan, and the blue one is after his death. And one of the things we're going to notice is that there are repeated waves of attacks through the Middle East. It's not that there was one attack and that was it, and it's not that each attack followed the same blueprint necessarily. There were different leaders and they operated in different ways. Some were more prone to seek alliances. Some were more prone to raising cities at first instance. There are a lot of differences in the way that they moved, and we're going to see all these repetitive invasions. But I also want to point out the size and the scale of the Mongol Empire at its largest extent. Right, we have something that stretches all the way from the Korean coast with Japan to nearly getting to the Bosporus. So significant amounts of territory and a variety of different climatic zones. And that's especially telling because nomadic groups have historically had success over sedentary civilizations prior to the arquebus and drill as a military tactic, which is in the 1500s. But even though we don't have a fundamental shift in technology or development or otherwise, the Mongols are significantly more successful than most of the other nomadic groups that we've ever had in history. And as Rama points out, it is the largest empire the largest land empire in history. The interesting thing is that the Mongols were able to adapt to the variety of conditions, and we're sort of going to talk about some of these adaptations in a bit. Another thing I wanted to put into perspective was the size of the calamity that befell the Middle East. These are the 5 biggest mass murderers in history. And the numbers, of course, are estimates. Some people believe there's more dead. Some people believe that there's less. But you can see that Genghis Khan has killed enough people to be in the first position, right? And considering the size of the planet at the time that he was living, that number of 40 million has a lot more weight behind it than Mao's number of 40 million as well. And there were a case, and of course that 40 million is all of the territories in which he was operating. And so at least half of that number come from East Asia, right? The Jin dynasty in North China, the Song dynasty in South China, the Koreans. So only 20%, 20 million of those are coming from the Western side. And from the Khwarezmian Empire, we have a population of around 10 million people all told across the empire. So obviously not all of them died, but a significant number of those populations died. And I wanted to put that in perspective of the size of the destruction that Genghis Khan did when he came to the area.
Just to add to that, Richard, when and then I'm probably going to get to that, when Genghis Khan, son Subutai invaded, Eastern Europe, in Moldavia and Poland, there is villages that took 600 years to repopulate. Yeah. So it was 600 years, the population was completely wiped out.
Just to be clear, actually, Subutai was not his son. Subutai was one of his generals.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry, one of his generals. But what's his name? Batu was his son. Sorry.
Yeah, Batu was his grandson.
Grandson. Yeah.
So we mentioned that we were going to talk about the tactics, and so I want to sort of address those now. The first one is I want to take a look at the bow. This is actually a very interesting military development. And you can see that the bow goes in and out sort of in a heart shape. The reason for that is that it's what's called a recursive bow, which means that you can get a lot more force on the bow itself with a shorter height, which means that you can carry this more effectively on a horse, and means you can shoot farther and still maintain enough power on the shot to pierce armor, right? This is what made the Mongol horse archers so lethal, is that they could move incredibly quickly. You can see that there's almost no armor on the soldier or on the horse, in contrast to a lot of the knights and heavy cavalry that we've seen in our previous lectures from the Crusaders and from the Khwarezmians. So you have they're extremely light, extremely agile, and with this recursive bow, they have incredible range. Mongols, because of their nomadic existence, similar to the Seljuk Turks when they first came out of Central Asia, were riding horses before they could walk. And so the skills that were normally used in their day-to-day lives were skills that they could then reuse in their military capacity. This also meant that the number or percentage of Mongols, it's better to say, who could be thrown into the field was significantly higher than in settled societies, where the majority of people did not have military experience and would not make effective soldiers. The second thing that I want to draw attention to is the way that Mongols used their horses to attack. So what they would do is what was called a feint. And a feint is where you move to attack the enemy, then you retreat to draw your enemy to pursue you. At a certain point, you've retreated to a point where there are fellow soldiers, and then you can close the loop around them. And usually you do this to separate, for example, the cavalry from the infantry, or you do it to separate lancers from archers, or you do it where you have a clear understanding that one of these groups will run to engage the enemy and a different group will stay behind to maintain position. And the Mongols were experts at this feint attack, where they would lure the enemy out into an area where they were less able to project their power, where different segments of the military corps of their enemies were separated, and therefore they were able to encircle and defeat the first section of the military, and then later the second section of the military, literally dividing and conquering. Another thing that is a key element of Mongol tactics is that the Mongol military would never be in one place at one time. It was not a straight shot where Genghis Khan had all of his army, all of his generals following behind him in a straight sort of linear pattern. He actually would have separate groups operating at the same time in different regions. So if one group was besieging a city, another group would be pillaging the countryside. And it meant that the settled leaders against which Genghis was fighting would have to divide their resources. Did they want to protect the cities? Did they want to protect the countryside? How many soldiers did Genghis Khan have in either location? It was incredibly difficult. Another thing that is not represented here, but is very common, is that the Mongols were masters of information acquisition. They wanted to know what their opponents were thinking, what their opponents were doing, what plans their opponents had, how their armies were dispositioned, what were the local conflicts between groups, and we're going to see how they play that out. But because of this, they're very aware of what the best pressure points are in the societies that they're conquering. They're always looking to figure out what is the easiest way to weaken the enemy before the strike. And similarly to pillaging the countryside, which weakened general resistance in the population, this would weaken general resistance in the militarized defensive positions. Another thing that I think is really unique about the Mongols is that Genghis Khan made very clear that any Mongol soldier, regardless of ethnic group, that was part of his military, if they died, their wives and children would receive a certain amount of financial support. And this is incredibly surprising for how counterintuitive it seems to our military leaders today, in terms of how the families of fallen soldiers are compensated or perhaps not compensated when one in their family makes the ultimate sacrifice. The reason that Genghis Khan did this was first to create a sense of nationhood and uniformity among the Mongol people. But secondly, because it meant that the soldiers knew that they could put everything on the line for the empire, and their families would be taken care of, whether they came home or not, right? They didn't have to hold back to a certain degree to worry about their own survival. They knew that the great Khan would look after them and look after their family and their progeny. And that sort of ties into the tribal unification aspect. One of the problems that we saw with the Seljuks, right, is they led this Turkic wave out of Central Asia, but it was a number of different tribes with all their different desires and needs for land. Now, Nizam al-Mulk resolved this with the Iqta system, which parceled the land between these different feudal groups. But at the end of the day, these feudal leaders became more powerful. They started fighting internecine civil wars. And at the end of the day, these different groups did not see eye to eye in the long-term administration of the empire. What the Mongols did under Genghis, which was so unique, was that they mixed all of the different Mongol groups into unified tribal contingents. So that way, every tribal group was represented in these large-scale formations. It prevented the creation of localized tribal affiliated groups that would then be able to turn effectively on other groups. And further to this, every Mongol unit was broken up in units of 10, and these units of 10 were charged that if one of their members left, all the 9 others would be executed, which meant that all these members were looking out and making sure that the unit stayed together to avoid these kinds of problems, right? And that's at the lowest level. At the highest level, you had units of 10,000, which were called the Tumens, which are the most famous units within the Mongol army. And the final point that I want to bring up is siege engines. We've talked about how the Mongols, their primary method of attack is with these recursive bows as horse archers. And that works incredibly well on the steppe, but it doesn't work well against cities. The thing is, the Mongols were not limited in the sense that they would only see tactics or use tactics that were familiar with them. They were willing to bring on innovation from wherever they could find it, right? So a lot of the siege engines and siege works that were used against the cities of the Middle East were ones that had been invented by either the Jin or Song empires in China. You had Chinese mangonels, siege towers, and they brought the artisans with them to build these things when they came to the Middle East. So in many respects, they were able to build siege engines, take down walls, and do the kinds of physical work that that many in the Middle East did not expect them to be able to do, because previous nomads had always struggled with cities. But the Mongols did not, because they had effective siege engines. Any questions before we go more into the history?
Well, one of the siege engines that they use is actually the first biological warfare.
Yes, in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, right, where they were throwing the diseased people over the wall until the city had plague, and therefore let them in, or everybody died inside. I don't know what the result was, but
yeah.
Yeah, one thing I read is about Mongols. They because their food, they can survive just by the milk of the horse. So they have no supply line, So that's one I heard.
No, that's very interesting, Jason.
Yeah, but I think that's one theory. Most of Asian is have the milk, they take intolerance, but for some reason they develop the tolerance for the milk, and they can drink milk. So they can, in general, if you have a long distance fighting, you are in trouble. For example, Chinese try to conquer the Korea. That's a terrible situation because the supply line is difficult. But for Mongol, there's no problem. One person with 2-3 horses, that's enough for them to eat. Yeah.
Right. No, that's very true. Moving through Manchuria was always difficult for the Chinese.
I have a couple of questions if it's my turn. One,
wait, just give it one second. I have a question in the comments. It says, usually the conquerors leave the local people alive as they need them as slaves and laborers. Why did Genghis kill everybody? Didn't the Mongols need slaves? Yes, the Mongols killed a number of people in certain cities. The thing is that it was a calculation of they would destroy these cities, and then the other cities wouldn't be as quick to rebel, and therefore they wouldn't have to post as many garrisons in those cities, and those were the places that they would get low-level labor and maintain the productivity of the region. In terms to the degree that it could be maintained. Of course, all the nobles, artisans, and other leaders would be deported back to Mongolia for whatever skill they had. And those would be useful slaves who would be pressed into service. Sorry, you were about to ask a question before I cut you off, Beth?
Actually, I just put one question in the chat, which was, I wondered what methods the Mongols used to gather intelligence on their enemies.
Sure, there were a variety of different methods. The most common one is that they would try to find disaffected people in the target city with whom they had a connection. The easiest one to relay here is the siege of Baghdad in 1258, and we're going to talk about that when we get to that time. The Hülegü Khan, who was leading the attack, his wife was a Nestorian Christian, and so was his mother. And so he reached out to the Nestorian Christians in the city, and they formed an alliance where the Nestorian Christians were kicking back information on the whereabouts of everything in Baghdad. So you had cases like that, where you had disaffected minorities who were targeted for this information or disinformation. There were other cases where they would intercept mail, and because of who they had pressed into service, they had a number of linguists who could figure out what was going on. And this is one that we're going to talk about a little bit sooner, which is in the siege of Samarkand. They falsified letters between Turkin Khatun and Alauddin Muhammad. Turkin Khatun was the mother of the Sultan, and the mother of the Shah, and Alauddin Muhammad was the Shah himself. And so he was relying on his mother to run the city of Samarkand while he was doing all kinds of military things. And the Mongols falsified the letters between them so that they didn't trust each other. And accordingly, they didn't coordinate effectively for him to bring the military close enough to Samarkand to relieve the siege. So you had lots of different methods that the Mongols used to gain information. They would also talk to the vassals that they had made. If you look at the situation, we're not going to address this because it's outside the Middle Eastern scope, but if you look at, for example, the raids on Russia, a lot of the information they had about the Rus principalities, about the Hungarians, about the Bulgarians, was supplied to them by the Venetians. The Venetians made an agreement that if they would be able to keep their colonies in the Crimea, then they would give all the information about the European kingdoms, and the Khan honored the agreement. Yeah, so
I have another question.
And one other thing.
Sure.
Of the 40 million people that Genghis Khan killed, did they die in battle, or were they?
Some of
did
them
they die when the
but
countryside was destroyed, or?
There are a lot of different ways that these people died.
Yeah.
Some of them died directly in battle. Some of them were slaughtered when the cities were taken. Some of them died because of the ecological destruction. And we're going to talk about the canalization.
Something I found on the web. According to hotnewshiphop.com.
Sorry about it. There was canalization throughout Central Asia and Iran, and those canals kept the irrigation working, and the Mongols destroyed that. So that led to a massive loss of life as well. So you have a variety of issues, and then combine that with the fact that the most educated, most organized, most scientific minds were being deported to Karakoram, right, to Mongolia. So the exact people that you would need to fix it were the exact people who couldn't show up to do so. So you have a cascading number of reasons why these people died, but you do have millions of people who literally lost their heads, in addition to millions of people who died from famine. Sorry, somebody else said that they had one more thing to add.
Yeah, that was me, Richard, Aaron.
Yeah.
You could argue the Mongols' intelligence architecture was the most sophisticated in the world up to that point in history, with the Romans, probably right behind them. They basically implemented, by today's standards, minus computerized systems, what the full spectrum of intelligence collection, minus sort of modern tech, that you have in modern military. So everything from reconnaissance scouts, pathfinders, basically, and separate from reconnaissance scouts, they had Chinese cartographers. They did something that is extremely cutting edge that only a few forces in the last, really 100 years or so have been doing. They reconstructed maps while on campaign, so that the real-time appreciation of topography could be implemented, not something as a post-campaign historical exercise when things get confusing. But then they also reconciled that. So what they basically had is like what you would call in the tech world now, A/B testing. They'd have an A team that would be constructing a real-time map, and a B team that would be documenting it like others would be doing. And then they'd reconcile that to capture any gaps. And then they'd obviously look past, any other maps they had and discarded them or archived them if they weren't accurate. And they had a documentation system for this. So it's probably the least explored area of their power, because it's not as Netflix sexy or whatever. It's just not, because it's sort of bureaucratically boring, but it is incredible when you really look at it. And they broke it down all the way into their force structure. So so this wasn't just done sort of at the empire level, but it was done all the way down into their forces.
Exactly. No, and there's stuff about the maps that we're going to get into as we move through. This also goes to Beth's question. If you look at this map, the areas in red are areas where the population sunk by double-digit percentages when the Mongols hit those areas. And you can see that a significant number of them are in the heart of the Middle East, right? You have Khwarezm, that area in the western part of Central Asia. You have the area in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, right? Mesopotamia. You have the area of the Caucasus, which was the former kingdom of Georgia. You have central Anatolia. You have central Iran with Isfahan in particular, and Nishapur. So you have a significant portion of the deadliest campaigns, relatively speaking, taking place in the Middle East. That's not to say that you don't have it in China. You can see the northern part of China, and you don't have, and you can also see in Russia that they got hit quite spectacularly as well. But the Middle East has the core area where, relative to the pre-war population, we see these cities and these rural areas being completely depopulated or significantly depopulated. And I just wanted to pull up the family tree so that way we know who we're talking about a little bit. The names that are in pink are the great Khans, right? Genghis was succeeded by his third son Ögedei. Ögedei was succeeded by his son Guyuk. Guyuk was succeeded by his cousin Mengke. Mengke was succeeded by his brother Kublai, right? And the other three that I put in green, Berke, Tolui, and Hülegü, are important names that we're going to see come up again and again. So I put them in green so that way they stand out a little bit. But this is the family of Genghis Khan to the extent that it matters for dynastic succession and other sorts of political issues. Genghis, of course, had numerous descendants and numerous wives, but only the children of his prime wife, Berke, were the ones who were recognized as legitimate heirs to the throne, right? And one point that we need to make is that Jochi was unclear. It was unclear whether he was truly Genghis Khan's son. We know that Berke was kidnapped around the time of Jochi's conception, and that she was raped during that period. So it's unclear whether that was the child of the rapist or Genghis's son. But Genghis accepted Jochi as his son because to refuse him would mean to force him to get a divorce from Berke. And he loved her to the extent that he didn't want to divorce her over the possibility that the son might not be his. But this was a commonly known fact about Jochi, that his ancestry was unclear, and we're going to see it's going to cause animosity between him and his brothers.
Yeah, one story about the Jochi is I heard that the Jochi name in Mongolian means guest. So probably Genghis Khan, no, he is not his son. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I would suspect that Genghis probably guessed that it's not his son. Just to go back over something that we talked about last time, so we have sort of a sense of the Khwarezmian military and what they look like, right? The Khwarezmian military has a lot of different elements to it. We talked about last time the Piadegon. These are the foot soldiers. They're generally equipped with a shield and a sword, or an axe, or some other simple implement. But the main forces that they used to control the territories were on horseback. And so you had three different horsebound soldiers. On the lower left side, you can see the Aswaran. The Aswaran, or the Asvaran, or the Savaran, there are different pronunciations depending on the dialect of Persian, are very heavy cavalry. If we remember from our looking at the Mongol horses had almost no covering. There was almost no armor on the people, but the Savaran have a very complete and difficult to penetrate system of armor on them. But it also means that their range as cavalry is significantly less than the Mongol horse archers. To compete with that, you have the groups on the left, right? You have the Ghulaman, who are Central Asian slaves. So their loyalty is as a slave to a master. They're not truly fighting because they believe in king and country, that kind of thing. And on the lower right-hand side, you had the Khwarezmian Lancers, and these were made of Kipchaks or Kangle. Both of these groups, Kipchak and Kangle, are Turkic tribes. And as we pointed out, with these particular tribes were very much disliked in the heart of Iran because they were seen as aggressive nomadic groups, and they weren't seen as civilized people. So this was the Khwarezmian military. And we also remember that Tekish, who was the prior Khwarezm Shah, expanded the territory to conquer Iran, that his wife Terkin Khatun was herself a Kipchak, and so the Kipchaks were loyal to her. And their son, who inherited the throne, was Alauddin Muhammad. And so this was the empire at the time that the Mongols encountered it. So now let's look at Central Asia to sort of see what the geography is. If you look at the area that Khwarezm controlled, they controlled up to the edges of the mountains. And once you get to those really difficult mountain highlands in what's now Tajikistan and in the central part of Afghanistan, their empire starts to fizzle out, right? You have this control over the low-lying areas of Central Asia, right? You can compare the map on the right with the map on the left in terms of elevations, and you can see the difference. You can also see that a lot of territory is around the Aral Sea, and that becomes their primary basis of water in the region of Chorasmia, Khwarezm. Okay, so you can see that after Genghis Khan conquered the north of China in 1218, he sent a convoy to Alauddin Muhammad in the city of Otrar, which is today on the border, on the Kazakh side of the border, but it's on the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And so when the delegation arrived in Otrar, Genghis Khan brought a message with him, right? He said, I am the Khan of the lands of the rising sun, while you are the Sultan of those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm agreement of friendship and peace. And from all the sources we have, it seems like it was the Mongols' intention to have a peaceful relationship with the Khwarezmian Shah. Now, Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, refused this, and he confiscated the wares from the merchants and imprisoned them. Genghis Khan sent 3 ambassadors to follow, and those ambassadors basically pled for the freedom of the merchants and that the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, be rendered to him to face punishment for arresting the merchants. Now, Inalchuk was one of Alauddin Muhammad's uncles, so he decided not to release Inalchuk. He killed 2 of the ambassadors, shaved the beard off the last one, and sent him back to Genghis Khan with the message that everybody had died and he should, and no peace, and that not to send anybody else. Now, the disrespect of the ambassadors was something that Genghis Khan would not accept, and so he made it his mission to destroy the Khwarezm Shah to the greatest extent possible. So the first thing is that the general area that anybody would have expected an invasion would be that upper arrow, the one that's labeled with Chagatai and Ugade. That arrow is through the Jungar Pass, and that is the easiest way, stressing the word easiest as opposed to easy. It's the easiest way to cross the mountains that divide China from Central Asia. And so the Khwarezm Shah put his forces close to Lake Balkhash in order to hold back that kind of advance. So in order to outflank them, Genghis Khan sent 2 of his generals, his general Jebe and his son Jochi, through the Tian Shan Mountains directly to the Fergana Valley. Now, this was very similar, you can imagine, to Hannibal's marching through the Alps, right? This is a very dangerous crossing. A lot of people died, but the element of surprise was preserved. And the Fergana Valley was one of the most fertile places in all of the Khwarezm Shah. So any attack there needed to be repelled, and it meant that the Khwarezm Shah had to divide his forces and send a contingent down to the Fergana Valley to protect it. While that distraction was going on, then Chagatai and Ugade crossed over through the Jungar Pass and directly attacked Otrar. You can see by this how effective the Mongols were at disorienting the Khwarezm Shah, because as soon as he's now protecting the Fergana Valley, Otrar is completely exposed, and the Khwarezm Shah can't muster the forces to effectively fight off the siege while trying to push Jochi and Jebe back into the mountains. I have a question about whether this is working chronologically through Mongolian history. It is, but only Mongolian history in the Middle East, right? Because the Middle East is our area of focus. So we're going to be talking about Mongol history in the Middle East, not Mongol history overall. Now, when it comes to Otrar itself, the city was besieged starting in the winter of 2019, and that siege lasted 5 months until a trader in the city opened the gate and let the Mongols in, probably because he was dying of hunger. And the Mongols killed a significant portion, if not all, of the city when they breached the walls. Now, in particular, the Mongols recovered Inalchuk, who was still inside of the city. And Genghis Khan was reported to have said, you spend so much time worrying about gold and silver. Now you can drink as much as you like, right? And poured the molten silver into his ears and into his mouth, which of course killed him. I'm sure this was used as inspiration for the Game of Thrones scene you can see in the upper right-hand corner. And after that point, the Mongols destroyed the city. They leveled almost all the structures. They knocked down all the walls. The fact that you have this reconstruction in Kazakhstan today it's exactly that. It's a reconstruction. The majority of the site is just raised houses. And Otrar was really the first city of the Khwarezmian Empire to fall to the Mongols. Now, part of Genghis Khan's intelligence gathering operation was also that he wanted to inspire the way the civilians he was going to attack would perceive him and how the political leadership would perceive him. And so he fit himself into the Islamic religious narrative, despite the fact that he was not a Muslim. Mongols in general had a tolerance for religion is sort of a strong way to say it. They supported any religion whose leaders could thank or worship or support the great Khan. So Islam was one such religion, and so they had people, high-ranking imams in the Mongol court, and so Genghis Khan was familiar with Islamic beliefs, and he constructed himself in the role of the Dajjal, or the Islamic Antichrist, right? I am the wrath of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent me as a punishment against you, right? It's interesting that Genghis Khan doesn't mind being seen as the bad guy, quote unquote, in the Muslim conception of reality, but he still wants to use the Muslim conception of reality to engender fear in the people that he's going to attack. It's the same reason why the cities were destroyed and so many people were killed, was to engender that kind of fear against resistance, right? That there's something supernaturally powerful about Genghis Khan and the Mongols that you shouldn't resist it, because resistance is against the will of God, against your success as a person. All right. Now we go ahead.
Rich, so just, oh, somebody wants to say something? I just wanted to add something quickly. Sorry. Or whoever was trying to add something, maybe they'll let go first. So
Yeah.
in the city of Otrar, the governor that executed the ambassadors, what was interesting is Genghis Khan had him executed and made a golden top from his skull. That was an interesting aspect. And another thing is he never thought of himself, as Rich is correct, as I know you thought of himself as a bad guy, but diplomatically, he said, you just killed my ambassadors, so I have a right to attack you. He never thought of himself of, I'm illegitimately attacking you. You basically challenged an embassy that I sent in a friendship manner, and therefore I have a right to attack you. So it was always justified.
Right. Oh, absolutely. From the Mongol perspective, the Mongols were justified. The point that I'm making is that it's very rare that a ruler of any type will insert themselves in the propaganda of their enemy as a natural enemy.
Right.
Right. It's always, we're the saviors, your government is deceiving you, right? We have the right answer, but Genghis Khan actually flips it, because what he wants to do is to instill fear, and what he wants to do is to create a supernatural aura about him that he can't do if he addresses it from the positive side. I have a question in the comments, which is, what were the religious beliefs of the Mongols themselves? We have a lot of different religious beliefs in the Mongol world. Genghis Khan, as far as I can tell, was a Tingrist, and that was the dominant religion in Mongolia. Tengri is the word meaning sky in most Mongolic languages, or some version of it is the word in most Mongol languages. And they believe that the great blue sky was the lord of all. And it has a lot of animistic connections and beliefs associated with it. Probably the most famous one is that the gods don't like the exposure of royal blood or the blood of animals. So when you kill somebody of royal blood, you have to wrap them in a carpet and stampede them by horses so that their blood is not revealed to the sky. And it's the same reason, for example, that Jews and Muslims who came under the reign of the Mongol Empire had difficulty in performing ritual slaughter of their animals, because Jewish and Muslim religious slaughter, shechita and dhabiha, both require the bloodletting of the animal from the neck. And that was seen as sacrilege to Tengrists. So that is the dominant religion, but we have other religions. Probably the biggest secondary religion would have been Buddhism, and the third would have been Nestorian Christianity. So we talked about how in Otrar you had these sort of two attacks going on. You had Jebi and Joche on the one hand, you had Chagatai and Ugide on the other hand, and Chagatai and Ugide ended up taking Otrar. There was actually a third prong that was led by Shinggis himself, and they came through the area to the north of Otrar, and they passed through what was the Kizilkum Desert, or the Red Sands Desert. Kizilkum is just Turkish for Red Sands. So they crossed the Kizilkum Desert, and the thing is that the Persians were completely unaware that this was even possible. The Khwarezm Shah had believed that the crossing of the Kizilkum Desert was impossible. And this goes back to Aaron's point about map making and cartography. Genghis Khan had taken the time to figure out where all of the oases were in the Kizilkum Desert, and therefore was able to move his forces through those areas. And also, as Jason points out, they didn't require as much food or as long supply lines because they could milk their horses. So you ended up having this ability to actually pass through the desert and arrive on the other side, right at the city of Bukhara, where nobody would have expected them. Once they got to the city of Bukhara, you now had the defense of the city led by the local governor, because the Shah, the Khwarezm Shah, was in the east, was still in the Fergana Valley, right? So he couldn't assist with the actual defense, and so it was actually the guardians of Bukhara themselves. And so the Mongols had their Chinese build the siege engines, and they started going against the city. There were attempts by the Bukharians to relieve themselves by sallying out and attacking, and the Mongols used this to their advantage, right? They went into that feint attack. So they pulled the cavalry of Bukhara far enough from the city walls so they could just turn around and attack them. And within a little more than a week, Bukhara had fallen. Now, in contrast to what we're going to see later, only a small portion of Bukhara was slaughtered, and there were fires in the city, but the fires were only in select areas of the city. But the city surrendered to the Mongols, and those who had expertise were deported back to Karakoram, to Mongolia. All right. Any questions here? So after Bukhara had fallen, the next target, that was February of 1220. Now we're going into March of 1220. The next target was Bukhara. Sorry, it was Samarkand. And Samarkand was the capital of the Khwarezm Shah. One of the things to point out is that before the war, most of these cities that we're going to talk about had populations of over 70,000, some up to 100, 110,000 people. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, you have to remember that the urbanization rate in most of the empires of the day was very low. We're talking 15, 20% of the population was urban. So you had significant populations in the rural area. In fact, it's estimated that all of Khwarezm, all of that Central Asian part of the empire, had a population of around 5 million people. But Samarkand was definitely the biggest city, between 100 and 120,000 people living there. And as I pointed out earlier, it was guarded or run by Terkin Khatun, the mother of the Shah. And as I pointed out earlier, the way that the Mongols were able to remove most of the military that would have helped fight against the siege engines that were besieging the city, the Mongols confiscated mail between Terkin Khatun and the Khwarezm Shah, and poisoned the communications between them such that they thought that the other was conspiring against them. Believing that his mother was a rebel, the Khwarezm Shah did not send aid to the city, and the Mongol siege engines were able to bring down the walls, and they slaughtered almost everybody in the city. The only people they didn't slaughter were those that they could take back to Mongolia. Now, while the response was delayed from the Khwarezm Shah, he eventually did make it to Samarkand before Samarkand fell, but then he escaped the city before the Mongols were able to take the city. And this enraged Genghis Khan because this to him was his victory. He should have been able, because Samarkand was the capital of the Khwarezm Shah. So he thought that he should be able to take the empire and kill Alauddin Muhammad, who was the king who permitted the massacre of his ambassadors. But the king was getting away. And so Genghis Khan tasked two of his most experienced generals, Subutai and Jebe, to follow the Khwarezm Shah wherever he went. And they were given 20,000 men in order to do this. Now, Jebe and Subutai pursued him all the way to the Caspian Sea, where Alauddin Muhammad found a small island and died there before the Mongols could get to him. He died of disease. But now that Jebe and Subutai were so far west of the empire, they got permission to do a scouting operation. And this scouting operation became one of the most successful campaigns of all the Mongols in history. The first place that they hit was Georgia, and at the Battle of Khanun in 1221, they massacred the Georgian people to the point where Georgia declared itself a vassal of the great Khan. Jebe and Subutai continued up through the Caucasus and made their way around the city of Derbent. Now, at that point, crossing the mountains was incredibly difficult, and Subutai and Jebe were in a very difficult position. Nevertheless, they were able to pay off Kipchaks in the army of their enemy to run away. And then once they had done that, they killed the nomadic forces arrayed against them and then marched further, the Kipchaks being weighed down by all the money that had been paid to them. Subutai and Jebe killed them all also. And then, of course, once they got back to what's now Ukraine, they were on the kinds of plains that they were familiar fighting in. But Jebe and Subutai would eventually win a number of battles on the Russian front. But in terms of the Middle East, this is the first time that Georgia was sort of brought into the Mongolic sphere. And this is the first time that that we really see Mongols having an effect in the western part of the Middle East. And of course, that's the death of Alauddin Muhammad. So you then have the siege of Urgench. The siege of Urgench is a particularly interesting story. The city of Urgench is just south of the Aral Sea in what's now Uzbekistan, very close to the Turkmenistan border. And Urgench, because of its proximity to the Aral Sea, is actually built on very swampy environment, which meant that the Mongols had an immense amount of difficulty in terms of arraying their forces against the city. It took them months to besiege the city and bring down the walls, which is much longer than it usually takes. Now, the siege was led on the north by Jochi, and he had been promised that this city would be one of his cities. And so he began to negotiate with the people of Urgench in order to have some kind of government, some kind of society when he actually took the city. But the other Mongol leaders, especially Ögedei, his brother Ögedei did not like this idea of negotiating with them and appealed to Genghis Khan that the city should be burnt and razed like Bukhara, like Samarkand. And Genghis Khan agreed, putting Ögedei in command and removing Jochi from command. Now, it's not clear if the opposition to Jochi taking power here was based on his parentage or based on the fact that he was more civilized, perhaps we could say, in how he wanted to treat the city. But ultimately, it did not matter. Jochi was removed from command, and this began to embitter Jochi towards the Great Khan. Now, one of the things that's interesting that we see here is that once Ögedei takes control of the city, he slaughters everyone and everything. In fact, the destruction of Urgench is considered one of the worst massacres in history. Nearly the entire city was leveled. Almost all the people were killed. Very few people were taken back to Mongolia. And because the city was next to the Aral Sea, the dams were broken that held the sea back, and a significant part of the city was flooded over.
So, Richard, on the Mongolian slaughtering, I think that they enjoy slaughtering people, right? They kind of like use it as a sport.
I mean, it could be. I don't want to opine on that because I don't have any documents that say for or against. But I don't think Mongolians were opposed to it. I think that the revulsion we have today towards blood and violence is something that is incredibly modern. I mean, if you look at for example, the way the Romans treated the gladiators, the idea that a lot of people would be bloodied and die was something that was generally accepted. But I would agree with you that the Mongolians had a particular lack of appreciation for human life other than their own.
Yeah, that's I kind of read some story, but of course that's biased by Chinese account. But basically, they kind of reward their soldier. One of the rewards allow them to looting and the killing. That's kind of like a reward, the incentive for the soldier.
Absolutely.
Well, one thing I just wanted to point out. So Samarkand, I mean, the area was is a Persian area, but the area was ruled by Turkic family, as you've pointed out correctly, Richard. And what's interesting is it was one of the flourishing area of the whole empire. In fact, in Samarkand, each of the houses had its own garden, which was the most important thing, where you basically can go outside and collect apples, whatever it is in season and stuff like that, which was unheard of in European nations or even in other nations outside. So it's a very flourishing empire. So I think some of it has to do with also jealousy. And what I also have read, and maybe that's wrong, and Richard, can correct me if I'm wrong, in Samarkand, due to the, Genghis Khan himself, even though there was plunging of the city, at some point he had to stop it by calling all the nobles into the city, in the center of the city, and that area was called Registan right now in Samarkand, and basically telling them, look, I didn't really come here to slaughter people. I know what I did. I'm just trying to, as Devon effect, we're trying to really create a ruling class here and stuff like that. And we know later in age, and Richard will talk about Timurids, there was a capital of Timurids, and was, obviously it was built by Timur, but some of the city was spared because of the fact, I think a lot of it had to do with jealousy. This is nomads coming into a civilization based, the first time they're meeting civilization, so to speak, civilized city, and it was a very civilized city to speak of.
I don't know how much I agree with that, but we have a lot of ground to cover. So I have a comment about Nishapur, and sorry.
Yeah, one quick point. Sorry for the background noise. I do think we can't underestimate the fact that as a high maneuver, totally mobile army, they did not want to take captives. They couldn't. I mean, that's part of their unique velocity of campaign. And so what we morally constitute as behavior we don't agree with, obviously, and probably no one else would in the modern world, this was their stratagem. So taking hostages or POW, what we would call POWs today, etc., at a city scale just didn't make sense. And then having to occupy and manage a city would completely shut down their whole campaign model.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. I have a comment that you have where Jane refers to numerous different people who made towers of bodies or killed ruthlessly. And I also have a comment about Nishapur, which I'm going to discuss when we get to Nishapur. So now that now that Genghis Khan has now in Samarkand, he's in the center of the empire. He sends, Genghis is in Urgench with Agide. He sends his son Tolui, his youngest son, around the rest of the country. So Tolui leads a number of campaigns against major cities in Khorasan. Balkh, Merv, Nishapur. Herat surrenders and then unsurrenders and then gets torched. Bamyan and Tus. These were all major Persian cities. One of the huge demographic shifts that is going to occur in Khorasan as a result of, let's say, the 200 years of Mongolic rule from Genghis Khan until the end of Timur, is that the Persian population that was the dominant ethnic group in the region gets replaced by the Turkic people who survive, which is why much of Khorasan is Turkic now and not Persian. So I want to talk about Merv. We have the story of Merv from Juvayni. Now, Merv was one of the largest cities in the world at this time. That includes the cities of China. A number of the cities of Khorasan were a number of these cities, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, Baghdad. When the Mongols take these cities are in the top 10 cities in terms of populations in the world, and they have extensive trade networks because of the Silk Road. And I just want to read the account from Juvayni, who is the Persian historian. You can see on the right-hand side the ruins of Merv, that's now in the modern country of Turkmenistan. And the Mongols ordered that apart from 400 artisans, the whole population, including women and children, should be killed, and no one, whether man or woman, should be spared. To each Mongol soldier was allotted an execution of 300 or 400 Persians. So many had been killed by nightfall that the mountains became hillocks and the plain was soaked with the blood of the mighty. Now, Juvayni was actually writing for the Mongols, right? So even the Mongols wanted to record the level of destruction that they had done. And you have these Persians who are literally writing about the destruction of their people. Now, I have a question about, in the comments, asking what would be the benefit of completely destroying these cities? And the thing is that the cities, although the population was completely slaughtered, you could repopulate them, right? To a certain degree. You wouldn't be able to populate the vast majority of the city, but you'd be able to populate the rural areas, and the Mongols were less concerned with the economic viability long-term of these territories, and were much more concerned with the lack of revolt that could occur if you left a significant enough population behind. So that was the chance they were willing to take. They were willing to lose the economic viability in service of the ability to control the territory. Additionally, a number of the cities that we're going to talk about, like Nishapur, like Samarkand, like Baghdad, have recovered to a certain degree in the intervening centuries. Merv was never rebuilt. There's a Turkmenistani city called Meri, which is close to Merv, but it's a very modern city. Okay. We have a comment about Nishapur, so I'm just gonna point out that this is a city that was completely destroyed, and the city was very depopulated. So the particular story with Nishapur is that it was led by Tokuchar, who was the son-in-law of Genghis Khan. He was married to one of Genghis's daughters. And during the siege, Tokuchar was killed. So when the city finally fell, Tolui gave permission to his sister, Tokuchar's widow, to organize the slaughter process of the city. and she made sure that every single person who could not be of service to the Mongols was slaughtered. And this began the ritual of what were called the skull piles, or the skull circles, where the Mongols would simply pile the heads of the dead in order so that way people moving by the city would be familiar with what had happened there, and that the propaganda of such a destructive event could influence the way that other people in the wake of the Mongol attack would respond to that Mongol attack. And just so we talked about the human death toll on a number of occasions, including the skull piles, which you can see a sort of a modern reenactment on the left-hand side. But one thing that we sort of touched on a little bit earlier, but I want to sort of stress it here, is that the area of Central Asia, this Khwarezm area, is not naturally a fertile area. You have the two rivers, the Amudarya and the Sirdarya, which feed from the which feed into the Aral Sea, and these two rivers can support a certain degree of agriculture, but nothing on the size of the cities that we've been seeing, right? Bukhara, Merv, Samarkand, these are all cities of over 70,000 people. You need large-scale agriculture to sustain that. And what had been done in centuries of Persian history, we talked about this, in lecture 2, with the Sasanian rulers who built these large canalization systems and irrigation systems to foster the large growth of population throughout Iran. These canal systems were critical in order to maintain the agriculture that allowed for such large populations. And the Mongols, as they came through, destroyed these canal systems. The result of this destruction is still felt today. You have massive desertification that occurred throughout the region of Khwarezm, specifically because of what the Mongols did in destroying these aquaculture systems and these fertilization systems. You also had a significant spread of disease because of how many people were dying and how many unsanitary conditions result from human bodies and their decay. All right. Now, there were still people alive after the Mongols passed through these regions. When we talk about the population that was lost, we're talking about around 20% of the overall population, because not necessarily everybody's in the cities. Some people are outside, some people are deported, but 20% of the population being lost, or 30%, the degree of depopulation that occurred was not complete. So you actually need to rule these areas. And so the Mongols did not want to appoint local individuals in order to rule those areas. They wanted to make sure that the leaders that they appointed were only loyal to them. But the problem that the Mongols had was that none of the Mongols themselves were educated sufficiently in statecraft that they would want to run a society. And conversely, if they did that administrative function, they would not be able to lead the hordes into battle. So they made the choice to take aristocrats and bureaucrats from one area of the empire and switch them to the other area of the empire. So the thing that we see is that the Mongols take a lot of leading religious bureaucrats, especially Taoists, from China and bring them into Central Asia. Zhou Chuji was a Taoist master. He came from Shandong. He was not given the power to govern, but he was responsible for overseeing Samarkand and a number of other Uzbek cities after they had been conquered, in order to install the Chinese who would be in charge of administering the area. We also know that a number of Western Liao who were already in the area were also chosen to lead some of the cities taken from the Khwarezm Shah. On the flip side, you started having the importation of Persians and Khwarezmians to China in order to administer China. These people were called Semuren, and as is pointed out, this is a statue in Yunnan, which is in the southern area of China, and you can see the boy is Zheng He, who is a famous explorer, navigator in Chinese history, and you can see him with his father, Ma Haji. In fact, the last name Ma in China often belongs to Muslim minorities who are the descendants of these Semuren. And in this case, Zheng He was not himself a Semuren, right? He was born long after the Ming had reclaimed China from the Mongols, but he was the descendant of Sayyid Ajal Shamsuddin Omar, who was a Persian bureaucrat who was brought to the southern China. I don't know if he was brought specifically to Yunnan, but brought to China in order to govern on behalf of the Mongols.
So, Richard, this is interesting. So, Zheng He is not okay. The note you said Mahaji of Yunnan.
Yeah.
Is he brought by Genghis Khan, by Mongol, or he just
his great grandfather?
Oh, okay, got you. So the last name Ma in China, okay, so it's from Omar because that's from Omar.
Yeah, that's my intuition here.
Yeah, sounds very good because I know in that area, okay, Yunnan, Guangxi, that area, a lot of Muslim, Chinese Muslim, and their last name is Ma. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And probably more famous to Westerners is Marco Polo. Marco Polo, for the time that he was in Beijing, under Kublai Khan, he was considered a Semuren. He was a tax collector and bureaucrat. And similar to the Persians, he had no local roots, and so that's why he was conscripted into this kind of service. We have very few documents, unfortunately, from the Persian side that discuss the Chinese Semuren who are operating in the Middle East. We have much more on the Chinese side of Persian Semuren who were operating in China. Now, after the eastern part of Khwarezm was taken apart by Genghis Khan, there was still the son of Alauddin Muhammad who assumed power, and that was Jalaluddin Mingburnu, and you can see him on the left-hand side. This is the last Shah of Khwarezm, and he managed to gather a combined military of 60,000 in what's now Afghanistan, and engaged with the Great Khan at the Battle of Parwan. Now, at the Battle of Parwan, Jalaluddin actually won the battle and forced the Khan to retreat. But the Khan came back and was able to pin Jalaluddin Mingburnu against the Indus River. So you had the forces of the Khan approaching from the north, you had Jalaluddin in the south, and the river to the south of him. And his forces were completely exterminated, but Jalaluddin made his way across the river. You can see that in the painting. Jalaluddin moving from the right side to the left side with the Khan's army at the edge of the river. And he managed to escape. The Khan could not effectively pursue him. He sent 2,000 riders after him, but they couldn't find him. And so Jalaluddin hid in India for a time. He tried to get the Sultan of Delhi. I think it was the Sultan of Delhi, but he tried to get the local Indian ruler on his side, but he was unable to convince him, and so he fled from there to the western part of Khwarezm, to the city of Rai. Now, Jalaluddin was an incredible military leader in terms of his knowledge and his ability and his strategic ability. He was much less effective as a diplomat, but or at inspiring the loyalty of his population. But anyway, when he finally arrived in the city of Rai in 1225, he then moved the capital to Tabriz, and when he moved the capital to Tabriz, he had to fight with the Adigozids, right? We talked about them last time. These are the Arabs of Iranian Azerbaijan. He defeated them completely and made Tabriz his capital. He secured the vassalage of the Shahanshahs and attacked the city of Tbilisi in Georgia, killing both Christians and Muslims. And by the end of 1226, he had consolidated Khwarezm in the western part of what was formerly the greater Khwarezmian Empire, and even taken territories that had never been held by a Khwarezm Shah before. Now, when it comes to how the Khwarezm Shah actually fell, he fell because of the battle of Yasychemen. And the Battle of Yasychemen occurred in eastern Turkey, close to where you can see that fortress in eastern Turkey on the map. And the issue is that Jalal ad-Din had invaded the area of Ahlat, which is in modern Bitlis region in Turkey. And that area was an area that belonged to the Ayyubid Sultanate. If we remember from our discussions of the Crusades, the Ayyubid Sultanate was the one ruled by Al-Kamil. And you can see a picture of Al-Kamil negotiating with Frederick II Hohenstaufen during the Sixth Crusade in 1228, which is only 2 years before. So this was on his eastern side. He had just taken this territory of Ahlat, and Jalal ad-Din was invading it. So Al-Kamil created an alliance with Shah Qaykubad of the Seljuk Sultans of Rome and Haytham I of Armenia, and they met at the Battle of Yasychemen. They were supported by the Abbasids as well, and for the first time, Jalal ad-Din was defeated militarily in this sphere. And because of his defeat, you had revolts all throughout his empire seeking to overthrow him. Eventually, Jalal ad-Din was able to put down those revolts, but he was significantly weaker as a result. Now, one thing, if you remember from last time, one thing, if you remember it from last time, was that as the Khwarezmians were pushed further west, they entered the Ayyubid Sultanate when that Sultanate was controlled in the 1240s by Sultan Asalib Ayyub, and the Khwarezmians, as a nomadic group, were able to effectively defeat the Crusaders at the Battle of La Fourbi and take Jerusalem back from the Crusaders in 1244, because the Crusaders had held it from 1228 until 1244. We also remember that the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was expanding to the east, and you can see on this map at the very far region is that Ahlat, that region that was taken by Jalal ad-Din, and that sparked a lot of confrontation between him and the Seljuks and the Ayyubids as well, because the Ayyubids controlled it before Jalal ad-Din. In 1240, it came under the control of the Seljuk Sultans of Rome. Okay. Then you sort of have, peace is the wrong way to say it, but after 1221, the Mongols really left Persia alone. They concentrated a lot more of their efforts in Eastern Europe, but in the 1230s, they were back, and they were led by Viceroy Chormaqan. Chormaqan pursued Jalal ad-Din all the way to Erzurum and defeated him there. Jalal ad-Din was eventually killed by a Kurd from Ahlat who said that Jalal ad-Din had killed his brother. And during this raid, Chormaqan gets the full submission of Georgia, and he gets the full submission of Armenia. But when we're talking about Armenia, we're talking about Armenian Cilicia, which is a territory on the Mediterranean Sea and is in modern day Turkey today. He gets the submission of these two groups, and then he finds that he has to go to Isfahan because there is a rebellion in Isfahan. He besieges the city and then diverts the river, the Ziyan-Deyrud, in order to starve the city and cause its capitulation. Of course, after the city capitulates, typical to Mongol form, there is a mass slaughter of the inhabitants. Just out of clarity, that Shahristan Bridge did exist during this time period. It's one of the oldest bridges that still survives in that part of Iran, and it was built by the Sasanians. So by this point, it was already 600 years old. So you can imagine this is exactly what it would look like, more or less, when Chormaqan besieged the city. Chormaqan, though, was succeeded by another viceroy, Noyan, Baiju Noyan. Baiju is a term for viceroy. So he was tasked with getting the complete and full submission of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Now we've talked about them before, but at this point the Seljuk Sultans had been made vassals by Chormaqan, but it had been about a decade, and it was time to renew their vassalage, and they refused to do so. Khosrow II, who was the new sultan of the Sultanate of Rum, believed that he could fight back against the Mongols, and so the Mongols made a fight at Kuzadagh, meaning Hairy Mountain, and you can actually see the picture in the center of that mountain forested with trees. That's why I got the term Hairy Mountain. This is not the exact mountain, but it's within a few kilometers of where the battle site took place, and you can see how difficult it would have been for Mongols to fight in that territory. Nevertheless, Baiju Noyan was a very skilled commander, and he was able to go against the Seljuk Sultans. Now, the Seljuk Sultans had managed to create an incredible coalition of forces to fight together against the Mongols. They had the Ayyubids of Syria. They had a number of Crusader mercenaries. They had Georgians. They didn't have Georgians. They had people from the Byzantine Empire, or what was left of it, what was called the Empire of Nicaea, and the Empire of Trebizond. So you had all these Christian groups, all these Muslim groups uniting against a smaller Mongol force led by Baiju Noyan, and yet the Mongols were incredibly successful in this battle. The Battle of Kuzadagh was the last successful showing that the Seljuks made, and while their empire still survived until 1307, it would forever be a Mongol vassal. Now, in the upper left hand, I want to point out something that's really interesting and that a lot of people don't take notice of. Crusader armor was so thick and so insulative that Mongol arrows could barely pierce it, even with this recursive bow, which made the Crusader knights some of the most effective soldiers of the battlefield. The problem is that there were only a few hundred of them, and the Mongols were able to overwhelm them. So we now have to move from that second wave of invasion, right? You had the first wave of invasion under Genghis Khan. You had the second wave of invasion under Chormaqan and Baiju. We now move to the third wave of invasion, and we're now at the time that Shinghis's grandsons are the ones really leading the fight. And Genghis Khan himself died in 1227. We're now in the 1250s, and Menke has just become the fourth great Khan. And because of his accession, power now shifts to what's called the House of Tolui, right? Tolui being the fourth son of Genghis Khan. And Tolui has four outstanding children in terms of their military acumen and their ability for leadership. And you can see from the Marco Polo series on Netflix, you have Kublai and Arek Berke, who are two of these brothers. And you have Hülegü Menke being the other two of these brothers. As Menke becomes Supreme Khan, he appoints Arek to look over the historic Mongol territories. He appoints Kublai to go east and finish the war against the Song in China, and he appoints Hülegü to go west and finish the wars against the Persian enemies. So in 1251, these groups separate and go in their distinct directions. I guess, any questions so far? Okay.
What's happening in China? What was there any interest now to the Chinese border?
Sure. There were a number of battles that had been fought by the Mongols against the Song dynasty. By this time, the Jin had fallen in, I mean, Jason can correct me, but I think the Jin had fallen by the late 1220s. And so now the question was whether or not the Song would fall as well. And there was one Song fortress called Xiangyang, which was a river fortress and was almost impossible to take down. The Chinese navy was much more effective than the Mongol navy, and it sounds weird to say, but the Mongols had conscripted Chinese boat builders to build them a navy to sail on this river. But the fortress of Xiangyang was resistant to invasion, and so the Song, as long as they could hold that fortress, could effectively prevent the Mongols from moving further south. Eventually Xiangyang would fall, but it would fall because of Middle Eastern trebuchets, which were unknown in Chinese siege warfare up to that point.
Right.
Yeah,
The
I
Song,
think that.
go ahead. Song, what about 20 million lived there? It's pretty huge.
It was a massive
Empire.
empire.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the history interesting because whoever go to China then become weak. So Jin in the northern China, right, and later on become weak. Then Liao, kick out the Jin, replace Jin, and when Liao stabilize in northern China, they become weak. Then Mongolian, replace Liao. Okay, and then Mongolian is different. They go all the way, just like Richard said, they go to the Xiangyang, and then eventually they slaughter the entire city, the Xiangyang, and they occupy the entire China. But China has so many people, Mongolia has no way to kill all the people. So turn out they settled down. The Kublai become the first emperor in China. But after few years, the Mongolian even don't know how to ride horse in China because the life is so comfortable. So, that's the interesting history and being kicked out by Ming dynasty.
So, that's absolutely right. When the Mongols created the Yuan dynasty in China, they began to become Sinicized. They began to take on Chinese customs and traditions. And it's not something that I was planning to cover, but when you start, because I was going to focus on the Middle Eastern side of it, but when you have the war that breaks out between the different grandsons, the reason Arek takes the side against Kublai is that he sees that Kublai is too Chinese. And that's even Kublai, who was still very Mongol in terms of his dress and his actions. And never mind his sons and grandsons, his grandson Temur Khan, who was his successor, was very sedentarized and didn't know anything but the Chinese court. Okay, so Hülegü ends up in Persia, and he has two charges when he gets to Persia. The interesting thing, though, is when Hülegü arrives in Persia, the Persians, generally speaking, are in favor of supporting him as a local ruler. They like him better than they like the Khwarezmians, which says a lot about how bad the Khwarezmians are. If the strong, stable hand of a Mongol is what you go for, but Hülegü was able to recruit a number of Persian soldiers into his ranks. There were two groups that continued to resist him. The first one were the Lurs. The Lurs are people who live in the Zagros Mountains. That's the western border of Iran. And it would be a straight shot from An-Najaf, or like just to the southeast of Baghdad. If you sort of follow that trajectory, you'll hit the area of the Zagros Mountains where the Lurs live. And Lurs are a Persian people, but they speak a slightly different language. And they had been resisting the Mongol conquest. Now, the Lurs had the tradition that came from the ancient days of challenges, where you would send one challenger and the enemy would send one challenger, and whoever won the fight between the challengers, that was the one who was chosen by the gods to have victory. The Mongols thought that this was a ridiculous tradition. You conquered it, you should get it. It's not about one random person. But they played along, and they sent their challenger to fight the lure challenger. And while the challenge was going on, they sent their force around the side of the mountains and then massacred all the lures from the backside. So that was how they removed the lures as a threat. The second group that they had to fight were the assassins. And the assassins, as we pointed out in our previous lecture, had resisted numerous attempts to take them down. On the Syrian side, you had campaigns like Saladin's to take them down. On the Persian side, you had campaigns from Nizam al-Mulk, Malik Shah, the Khwarezm Shah. All these groups could not take down the assassins, but Hülegü Khan had 10 tumens. He had 100,000 soldiers at his command, and he built massive siege engines and smashed several major Nizari Ismaili assassin fortresses, to the point where the old man of the mountain at that time surrendered to the great Khan and gave up Alamut, the chief fortress, as well as numerous other assassin fortresses, in return for clemency. The old man of the mountain did not receive clemency, but the people did. And so you didn't have the same degree of massacres when the Ismaili fortresses were taken. But it meant that Hülegü now was in complete control of Iran, and then all resistance to his authority had now been quashed. So then we move to Baghdad, right? In 1258, after dealing with the lures and assassins, Hülegü Khan comes to Baghdad. Now, Baghdad was probably the biggest city in the world. It had a population roughly around 1 million people. It was an incredibly cosmopolitan city. We've talked about before, especially in the early days of the Abbasid Caliphate, with the creation of the Bayt al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. This city was also one of the most educated cities in the world, incredibly cultured and developed. Hülegü reached out to Caliph al-Mustasim to request his surrender to the Mongol Empire, and Caliph Mustasim made the choice of resisting. And so in order to collect intelligence, Hülegü Khan sent a small emissary group to the edge of the city. Believing this to be the full Mongol army, Caliph al-Mustasim sent out his soldiers to kill that intelligence gathering party, and they were successful in this. But then the whole Mongol army converged around the city, and by that point, Caliph al-Mustasim pled for clemency. But by the time the Mongols had actually engaged the city, they were not interested in that. Now, a few points to make about the way that they're attacking Baghdad. You can see that there are actually two sets of walls around the city, right? There's the walls that are directly around the city, and then you can see probably about a few meters away, there's another set of walls with small holes between them that circle around the city, but not a complete one. Those second walls were actually built by Chinese who were in the service of Hülegü, and these walls were built to protect the catapults. So that way, from the city, it would be impossible to stop the siege engines from hitting behind the walls and taking down the city. The Mongols were able to besiege the city, and when they entered, all of the people of Baghdad were slaughtered, with one exception: the Nestorian Christians. Hülegü Khan's wife was Nestorian, and we also know that Nestorian Christians were giving information to the various spy groups that had come to the city beforehand, and giving information about Baghdad's defenses. So the Nestorian Christians, as long as they stayed in their churches, were not killed. But all of the Muslim population of Baghdad, which was the vast majority of the city, was put to the sword, with the exception of those who were seen as useful and brought back to Karakorum, to Mongolia. Now, there are many stories about what Baghdad looked like after the siege. There are stories about the rivers running red with the blood of the people. There are stories about the rivers running black with the ink of the scholars, because the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was destroyed, and numerous other priceless treasures that had been in Baghdad were were destroyed or ruined. There are a number of stories about what happened to Caliph al-Mustasim. Probably the most likely story is that he was rolled up in a carpet and trampled because he was considered a royal, and therefore, under Tengrist view, his blood could not be exposed to the sky. But you can see in the upper left-hand side a different story, a different rendition of what had happened, which is that Caliph al-Mustasim was locked away in a room where all he had was gold, and because one of the things is that he had resisted the Mongols to preserve his wealth. He didn't want to pay tribute, and so the Mongols would say, if your gold is so useful to you, now you can eat it. There are also stories of Caliph al-Mustasim being fed liquid gold, similar to the way that Inalchuk was fed liquid silver. But the most striking thing here is that this was the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. And Islam had existed with a caliph by this point for over 500 years. And to not have a caliph was incredibly disorienting. We talked about 2 weeks ago how the Hafsids in Tunisia declared themselves a caliphate. The Mamluks tried to steal one of the last Abbasid princes, who was very distantly related to the caliph, to create their own caliphate in Egypt, which was somewhat recognized, somewhat not. There was never, after the Abbasids, until the Ottoman Empire, there was never a caliph who commanded the kind of authority in terms of religious matters that the caliphs of Baghdad did. And the Islamic world was very much shattered by this event. Now, there's also discussion that this is the event that ended the Islamic Golden Age. I think the Islamic Golden Age ended about a century before. But whatever science, technology development that was still going on to the limited extent that it was, in the 1200s, this definitively ended it. From this point forward, we're not going to see major advances in the arts and sciences coming out of the Islamic world. So at this point, Hülegü Khan was now planning to move into the Levant region and challenge the only remaining obstacle to his power, which was the recently created Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt. Now, the Ayyubids still controlled the Levant region. The Mamluks had not yet taken the Levant region from the Ayyubid princes who controlled it. And the Ayyubids did send a delegation to Menke Khan, pointing that they would surrender. We don't know why the Great Khan did not accept their surrender. It could be from the fact that they fought alongside the Seljuks at the Battle of Kuzedar. It could be that the tribute payment wasn't large enough. We just don't know. And so Hülegü Khan brought together his Mongol troops, led by Kitbolka, who was an Nestorian Christian as well, in tandem with Cilician Armenia and the Crusader state of Antioch, led by Bohemond V. And all these three forces converged on the city of Aleppo, which was besieged and the population slaughtered. They then moved to Damascus. And when they got to the city of Damascus, there's the famous story, we don't know whether it's true or not, but that the three Christians, Kitbolka, representing the Mongols, who was a Nestorian Christian, King Hethum I, who was Armenian, and King Bohemond V of Antioch, who was Catholic, right? So you had Nestorian, Armenian, and Catholic, entering the great mosque of the Umayyads in Damascus, the fourth holiest site in Islam, and desecrating it through worship of Christ in the facility. They then continued, and they even made, after winning taking over a Jordanian fortress at Ajloun, they eventually created a garrison at Gaza with 1,000 men. Now, while Antioch and Tripoli were aligned with the Mongols, up to this point, the Crusader state of Jerusalem did not make an alliance with the Mongols. but they didn't make an alliance against them. They were simply mulling it over. During this period, Sultan Qutuz creates his rebellion in the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and takes power for himself in order to deal with the threat coming out of Mongolia.
Richard, yeah, so it's interesting. So Crusade and the Mongolian, they overlap in this area, right?
Yes.
So so eventually Mongolian fail in this area, am I right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
The Mongolians fail and the Crusaders fail, but in these early stages, the Battle of Aleppo, the Battle of Damascus, these are successes for the Mongols.
Oh, okay. Whenever they reach the sea, they cannot move on. I think that's the reason.
Well, no, they were trying to fight over land. They were going to go over the Sinai Peninsula into Egypt. Now, one of the difficulties was that in 1260, Hülegü Khan found out that Münke had just died in late 1259. And so he withdrew a significant portion of his forces from the Middle East and went to attend the Kurultai, which is a council where the Mongols choose who the next great Khan will be. And because Hülegü was out of the area, he left Kitbolka, that Nestorian Christian general, with 2 tumens, 20,000 men, to guard the areas that have been taken. Now, the thing is that there weren't a lot of grassy areas in the Levant region where the Mongols could keep their horses. So for the most part, he kept his horses in what's now Syria or Lebanon, close to Baalbek. Baalbek is in modern Lebanon, but in that area. And the Mamluks saw this as the perfect time to engage while the enemy was weaker. So Sultan Qutuz of the Mamluk Sultanate reaches out to the Crusader state of Jerusalem, knowing that they haven't made any agreements either for or against an alliance with the Mongols, and asks for an alliance with them. The Crusader state of Jerusalem doesn't want to align with the Mamluks because the Mamluks have been their historic enemy, and also they are afraid of the Mongols. So they choose a cautious policy of neutrality, but they do allow the Mamluks to march through their territory. And they managed to encounter Kitbolka near what's called Ain Jalut. Ain Jalut is, in Arabic, just means the well of Goliath, Goliath being the biblical character, because supposedly David slew Goliath here, which is very fortuitous. Now, the forces, in terms of size, between the Mamluks and the Mongols were relatively equal. The Mamluk force was slightly larger, but what's interesting is that the Mamluks defeated the Mongols by using the Mongol feint strategy. So Baybars, who was a key Mamluk commander and himself a victim of Mongol displacement, he was from what's now Kazakhstan. When the Mongols invaded, his family was enslaved and sold to Egypt as slaves. So he was himself a horse rider, just like the Mongols were, and was familiar with those tactics. He went to Kitbolka's front and pulled Kitbolka's front line into the larger defensive position that Sultan Qutuz had in the rear, and they were able to encircle the Mongol forces, kill about 5,000 of the 20,000 Mongols there, and the rest of the Mongols retreated, especially after Kitbolka was killed on the battlefield. If you look at the picture in the upper left-hand side, you can actually see that the Mamluks and the Mongols are actually not dressed that differently. The Mamluk, of course, on the white horse, the Mongol on the orange horse, but in terms of they have short swords, shields, light armor, the horse is unarmored, right? Because it's the same kind of steppe nomadic fighting, and it turns out that you need fire to fight fire. Now, Hülegü Khan was not going to let this Battle of Ain Jalut be the end of the campaign in the Levant, and he prepared to strike again. But this is why he was not able to recover that territory. So at this same time, at the Kurultai, there was a fight over who would be the next great Khan. Kublai got votes from Hülegü and several other minor Khans, primarily in the region of China. But Arik Berke got the support of Berke Khan, the son of Jochi. Berke Khan was in control of the Golden Horde, which is the area of what's now Russia and Kazakhstan and Ukraine that the Khans controlled. Now, Berke Khan had converted to Islam and was therefore more amenable to a relationship with the Mamluks. At the same time, he was deeply angry with Hülegü Khan for several reasons, not just his support of Kublai over Arik Berke, but also for the fact that he had killed the Caliph of Islam. So to the extent that he was religious, he saw this as a vast negative. And he also desired a number of the territories that Hülegü Khan asserted control over, especially in the Caucasus region. So Berke Khan declared war in 1262 with Hülegü Khan, and Berke Khan was significantly more powerful than the Mamluks and a significantly bigger threat to Hülegü Khan, because Hülegü controlled areas that bordered on significant amounts of Berke's territory. In fact, the war between the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, which is the government that Hülegü ends up setting up in Persia, long outlives these two men and really only dies away when the Ilkhanate stops existing. So if we look at the world in 1262, this Mongol Empire that was once united and controlled a vast amount of territory has now split into 5 different countries. The Golden Horde, the White Horde, the Golden Horde will eventually conquer the White Horde, but the Golden Horde, the White Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Mongols of the Yuan dynasty, which is China, right? So you have all of these different regions, and the Golden Horde tends to be aligned with the Mamluks, while the Ilkhanate and the Yuan dynasty are aligned with each other, and Chagatai attacks whoever is on their border. So the reason for the strong alliance between the Golden Horde and the Mamluks isn't just Islam, it's also trade. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, and in order to replenish their stock of Eastern European, Eurasian steppe nomads who would be serving in their military government, they needed to buy them from the Golden Horde. So they had trade with the Golden Horde, specifically to buy and sell Circassian and Kipchak slaves to the Mamluk Sultanate. And they maintained a defensive policy that if either one was attacked by the Ilkhanate, then the other one would attack as well, which meant that Hülegü Khan had to measure his attacks against the Mamluks if he wanted to do them, because otherwise he would risk the Golden Horde attacking, and the Golden Horde could bring much worse to bear on the Ilkhanate than the Mamluks could. So that's basically where we end today. Do we have any final questions?
I think I think that's great. You know, I think the one thing interesting is what's the purpose of the Genghis Khan or Mongolian, conquering. It sounds like they have no purpose. The conquering is their own purpose. That's why they slaughter all the city and they never think about settle down. So
I think that's right. I don't think that they were really thinking about running a sedentary civilization, and so that just wasn't what their goal was and what they were doing. I have a question in the comments of how long did the Southern Song survive? The Southern Song survived,
I think, another 200 years. I think.
No, Kublai Khan destroyed them.
Kublai Khan because
so they survived, I want to say, until about 1290. I think that's about 1285, 1290. So another 30 years after this.
Yeah, but Southern Song start from Jin, the Nuchen, okay, kick out Liao.
The song had existed for about 400 years. It was,
so about 200 for Northern Song and 200 for Southern Song. Yeah.
Sorry, somebody else was asking a question?
Yes, Richard, I have a question concerning the Crusaders.
Sure.
It appeared to me it would be in their best interest to let the Mamluks and the Mongols go at each other. So why did they show favor to the Mamluks?
You mean the Crusader state of Jerusalem?
Yes, during
Okay.
the Ain
Yeah,
Jalut
no,
campaign.
I just want to clarify because Antioch and Tripoli became vassals of the Mongols.
Okay.
The reason that the Crusader state of Jerusalem, they took the position of neutrality, right? They gave the Mamluks permission to go over their territory, but they didn't provide any additional soldiers. They didn't provide any rest. They allowed them to camp and rest outside of Akkar, but that was about it. I think the Crusaders realized the Mongols were worse than the Mamluks were, and so they sort of wanted to see if the Mamluks could take care of it, and then they can go back to hating them. So I think that was sort of the thought process. The other difference was that in many cases, Europeans, like in Europe and Crusader Franks, believed that the Mongols were Christian, right? Because who else would be fighting a long campaign to destroy Muslim cities and sack them and the rest of them? Like they just had no concept of East Asia in terms of its religious and political orientations. So when they discovered that they were pagans, it was really a shock to them. And so I think the earlier Crusader states were already vassals. They couldn't really do much about it. But by the time they came to the Crusader state of Jerusalem, they were aware of who the Mongols were.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, by our modern standards, the Mongols seem like aliens, like an alien invasion.
Yeah.
You know, these sort of you know, almost mechanistic, you know, completely alien civilization in every form, you know, language, you know, habits, customs, warfare. I mean, just everything. You know, it's sort of like if any of you ever watched the movie Predator from the 80s. You know, I think on the whole, there was a sense that all of whichever religious order existed would collapse under the Mongol yoke, basically.
Yeah.
Actually, in Eastern Europe, they call them, and in Russia, it's an invasion of Gog Magog, and you know what
Exactly.
that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
well, no,
Richard, along the same lines, though, didn't they have like 3 Christians in that Mongol army, like that you described, an Nestorian
Absolutely.
Christian, or Armenian
Yeah.
Christian?
Well, the Armenian Christian and the Catholic were from Armenian Cilicia and Antioch, which were 2 Mongol vassals. But yes, there were Christians in the empire. Kitbuka was a Christian. And as I said, the wife and mother of Hülegü Khan were Nestorian Christians as well. But
and there were Muslims also. There were, you know, so there were. But I think that's part of the fear, is that, you know, you had a civilization or a set of civilizations to the west, let's say, that felt that they had these neat boundaries and that they were correct, right? And it was sort of the battle of the gods. And then the Mongols are this, you know, if you guys have ever seen the movie Predator, just sort of opportunistic, you know, mechanistic, you know, super aliens that could just run through a place, you know, and let's think of this, you know, places that never fell or took eons to fall would fall in a matter of, you know, weeks or months. And so the velocity just was, it had to be just, you know, like the movie Independence. Now I'm using a bunch of, you know, kind of B plus level movie analogies, but, you know, kind of Independence Day. You guys remember that?
The other thing is that we forget how huge the size disparity was. And with the exception of Subutai and Jebe in Russia with only 2 Tumens, Hülegü Khan had 100,000 men at his disposal.
That's right.
Now, in the Chinese world, 100,000 men is a normal military. In Persia, in the Crusaders have never seen anything like this.
That's right.
I mean, if we remember when we talked about the Battle of Arsuf, the Battle of Arsuf between the Mamluks and the Crusader state of Jerusalem, you had 250 knights at the castle in Arsuf. That's not 250,000. That is 250. So this is just orders of magnitude of size that like made no sense.
Well,
And that's why the Mamluks, and that's why the Mamluks took advantage when Kitbuka was there with only 2 Tumens, because the full force of Hülegü Khan, it would have destroyed Egypt too.
Yeah, and the thing too is I think in their world, the only thing that made sense at this scale was the Roman Empire. But what we have to remember is that was a foot soldier force, basically. I mean, it was massive, but it was a foot soldiers force. So to recognize that this was a 2 to 4 horse per horseman force, which is a key piece of the whole. Let's kind of view that as their supply chain, right? That was a critical piece to their architecture, which doesn't really get talked about much. Is that you basically had their version of a squad, which was 10 horsemen. There'd be roughly 25-30 horses, and they would switch their supplies and in essence sort of refuel their mobilization
I have a question is about Mongol tactics. During the battle, horses belonging to one soldier, they were running along with him, or they were kept somewhere?
They were kept in the camp.
Yeah. So the other thing too is that
because those are for distance riding.
Yeah, and exactly. So so that's the other thing, is there were specializations in the horses that were used. So in essence, when you're firing, and of course that's the other thing, is the way that they specialized in firing their compound bows. They were basically like snipers, really, the kind of distances that they could hit. And there's a type of central step horse it's almost like a great big pony almost, and so when it gallops, it doesn't go into a full gallop, right? It sort of just does these like little steps, almost like a mouse, and the top of the horse where you sit on can be much more stable, and then they have this wood seat that they could sit in, so they could be pretty stable in relative terms, and then they could fire reasonably accurately when it came to that. And they would have their feet like these different legging units that they could kind of move their body a little bit, like that wood platform could move maybe just 5 degrees or whatever, so they could kind of center themselves a little better, just like you would today if you were teaching someone to fire in a weapon squad. Having someone turn sideways running is going to be pretty inaccurate, whereas if you square up, you're going to be much more accurate. It's the same principles. So they wound up just, and the other thing is the kind of swarming tactics that they had. So one group of 100 would feint, another group would attack directly, one would flank. And so what they were doing objectively, and they used flagging systems and horns, they were breaking down the communications, basically the battlefield communications on their enemy. They were collapsing in the military today, we call it OODA, but it's basically your decision cycle. And there's a legendary colonel named Colonel Boyd, passed away about 20 years ago, and he came up with this whole model of rapid decision making. And the Mongols sort of fit this at an army level, which objectively, I don't think we've ever seen a force top to bottom that has had that type of decision making, dynamic decision making, kind of as real time as you could on the battlefield. I mean, even today.
Okay, Richard, let me ask one more question, please. Do we trust the numbers for the Mongols? Because if they have 100,000 people in the Levant, is there grassland available to feed 500,000 horses or more?
This is actually one of the difficulties. in terms of the Mongol presence there. We know, for example, that every winter that the Hülegü would have to recamp to what's called the Jazira, which is the upper area of Mesopotamia. So what's now eastern, like the area where Islamic State had control, eastern Syria, northern Iraq. That area has a bit of grassland, and that's enough pasture land for a significant force. We actually talked about last time how when the Turkic groups were there, everybody was fighting over control of the Jazira because of this need to provide pasture for your horses. So in terms of Iran, Iran has grasslands, so Iran has enough space for them. But it is a question that a lot of alternative historians, ask of, like, how would the conquest of Mamluk Egypt have gone? Because Egypt doesn't have large grasslands to sustain this kind of force either. They have some grassland, but not enough.
Well, so the Nile, when you start going further south on the Nile, do have a more hospitable terrain.
Sure.
The other thing to recognize is that they didn't just show up with 100,000, right, all the time, right? It would be, they would, they would have basically their version of tour rotations, but just much faster. So they might be 6 weeks or 3 weeks, and so there might not be 100,000 all at once. So there more than likely wouldn't be. It might be 20,000, and they would have, and so one phase might be setting up sieges and doing reconnaissance, coming up with battle plans.
Richard, I will go into what's the next on the topic.
Sure. The next topic is going to be the Ilkhanate and Timur. So it's going to be basically taking from this point, what did the Mongols do when they were in power in Iran, and how did that decay? And then we're going to see that the Chagatai princes are led by a general named Timur, and he ends up taking both the mantle of the Chagatai and the Ilkhanate and trying to reconquer the lands of the Mongols. And we're going to sort of follow that. That's going to be our next discussion. And then after that, we're going to move to Anatolia, and we're going to spend a lot of time in Anatolia. We're going to work through the early Ottoman, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the early Ottomans, and all the way to the modern period. So that's going to be a few months in Anatolia.
Richard, I really thank you. This is it was amazing presentation. I mean, we have a lot of new people today. Two remaining left is the new that's new is Wei and Charles. Welcome to the group, guys, and or girls. I'm sorry if I.
Yeah, and also there were a lot of people who came for the first time who regrettably had to leave early. Of course, since it's recorded, they should be able to find it if they want to see the rest of it. But yeah, hopefully more of you will stay for the less sexy parts of history. But there's always that. And if you know a certain part of history that I'm planning to cover, because I'm going to go through the chronology, and you want to present or you want to add something, or please do reach out to me. I'm more than happy, actually delighted, to have guest speakers who want to give a presentation on something that really excites them from the time period. So,
Richard, I have just two words, as always.
Richard, I have Ethan that wanted to do something on adamants. So if you want, I can have him reach out to you.
Are you talking about John?
No, Essen. Remember he came a couple of sessions ago. He said that you want to do an adamant. He's actually from Turkey.
Yeah. No. His name is John. I reached out to him. So we'll see. He hasn't gotten back to me with what he could add or not. I showed him what my slides were. He's generally in agreement with them, but there's all kinds of things, because like I tend to do military and politics, and there are a lot of people in this group who are really much better at art or at engineering or something else, and that's fantastic.
But nobody's better at putting it all together like you. So we're not definitely in presentation and speaking, you know, and putting it all together, you're numero uno. So not even a question. Hands down, hands down.
Yeah, great job. Absolutely.
Thanks again, Richard.
All right.
Yeah.
I
Thanks.
dropped in, oh, quick thing. I did drop in the chat for those of you interested, a couple of pieces based on our conversation. So it's basically it's a really good war college student who mapped the air-land battle doctrine to the Mongolian invasion tactics, and it, you know, maps, you know, 80-90%, and then also on the approach to intelligence, like the full spectrum intelligence that the Mongols had.
Excellent. I'll post it on our YouTube channel. Just to remind everybody, tomorrow we're going to talk about Lysander, which is Plutarch. So if anybody interested, he's a war hero and Persian wars. You know, basically Plutarch is explaining him. On Thursday, I know we have a lot of presentation this week. I'm talking about archaeology and Old Testament or Torah or Bible, whatever you want to call it. So there's going to be very light, you know, like an hour presentation. Mostly going to be discussions. Again, you know, it's going to be very light. And on Saturday, we're going to talk about First Macedonian War versus Rome, Philip the Fifth. And then on Sunday, Jane is going to do a presentation on whether the you know, King Arthur was a real figure or imaginative figure. So we'll talk about that. So a lot of stuff this week, and then next week, obviously, Richard's presentation on Ilkhanate and Timurids and stuff like that. All right, guys, everybody have a nice evening. Excellent presentation, Richard, and we shall continue in this matter and add more people, and people should enjoy history. I mean, I appreciate it, guys. You guys joining and great discussion. Thanks, Aaron.
Great job, Richard.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody. All right.
Great job.
Bye.